Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have about 2 minutes till start time. I have posted in the chat for everyone a link. This link, and I'll repost so it'll pop up for you. This link is to a survey that I failed to do at the end of last class. It is asking your thoughts about the first 3 classes. So while we're waiting for folks to log in, take a few minutes and answer those questions for me on the first 3 classes.
Sheldon, did you say you just sent us a link or what?
It's in the chat.
Oh, okay, thank you. Can I ask you another question while we're waiting?
Sure.
I believe it was in week 2, the first time we were here, you said something about booklets that we could get at the extension office, and you thought, or maybe it was when I was talking to you personally on the phone, and you said you could get extension, there were booklets there of like 50, 60 pages that we could buy for $5 a piece. Is that correct?
There are several publications related to gardening that you can pick up at the extension office. Off the top of my head, I don't remember that of any of them being fee-based publications. So all the gardening ones are free.
Because when I talked to Greg, he said they didn't have any at all. They could print some off, but he wasn't familiar with any of them or anywhere near that large. And the only ones I saw that he referred me to on the UT, it was they were only like 4 pages long.
Yes, most of our gardening ones are 4 or 5 pages. There may be one a little longer than that, but they're not very long.
Okay, I was under the impression that they were like 50 pages long or something.
No.
Okay, then we're okay then.
The link that I just posted is to our publications search page. If you type gardening or vegetable gardening, or if you want to be more specific, like tomatoes, you can find all of our publications related to that topic. And we can print or provide those if you want hard copies as well.
Is this chat link, is it included in the recording? Will I be able to see it later on the recording?
It is not included in the recording, but I have been sending out some emails after class with some links mentioned in the class that I'll include the publications link.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Follow up next day or 2. For those that joined in the last 3 or 4 minutes, there are 2 links in the chat box. The first one is to a Google form survey asking your input on the first half of our class series, the first 3 classes. And the second is for our publications. While you all are finishing up the survey, I am going to transition to the program for tonight, and we'll be ready to get started. We do have someone watching our chat box, so if you have questions for me, please go ahead and just post those, and Stephanie will be passing them along at the appropriate time. So feel free to ask you
Sheldon, Tanya says she's only seeing one link.
yes, I am trying to fix that.
We see both of them.
She may have logged in just a minute or two after the link was posted, in which case she may have missed it. That's the long version, but it should take her to the form. Okay, we'll get started with tonight's topic. And we are discussing in the first section, managing water and weeds. Four things that we want to think about in this discussion tonight is the fact that plants need water. And if the weatherman is right from what he said a little while ago when I was watching the weather, we may be in for a dry summer. We're already drier this year than normal, so we're not off to a good start. And plants do need water and need plenty of water. So we're going to discuss methods of providing that water. We're going to discuss some mulching options, which will help with irrigation and water management, but also help with weeds. And we'll also discuss the means of preventing and controlling weeds in a garden. If nothing else, when it comes to water, most gardens will need 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. So that would be the equivalent of 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rain every week. When you think about particularly summers in this area, those of you that are new will realize that sometimes we don't get those rain showers every week. If we get showers, it may not be enough. Or we may go a couple of 3 weeks and then we catch up with the amount of rain that we need. So it doesn't come when we need it. We're going to talk about raised beds in more detail in the latter part of this series. But raised beds, while a lot of benefits from managing the plants and managing weeds, may require more water than a in-the-ground garden because of the way that they're designed, the type of media you're using, and the fact that they just simply drain much quicker. So one thing you might want to think about is putting a rain gauge in or near your garden, just so you can keep track of how much rain you actually receive. And if you receive that inch, inch and a half during the course of the week, you may not necessarily need to add extra water. Make sure you check the gauge frequently and keep a record so that you know what rainfall you've had and what your crops have received. And as I noted, that'll help you time your irrigation and also how much you need to irrigate. And we may have, as I noted in the summer, rain showers that come through. They may wet the top of the ground, but they may do little else. So having a rain gauge will tell you exactly how much rain you received. And water can be very important at various times during a plant's life. It is critical at germination when the seed is trying to get out of the ground. It's also important when you're transplanting plants. If you started them indoors and moving them outside, water can be very critical at that point. The development of the plant. Plants go through different growth stages, and each of those stages is going to require water for the plant to develop properly. It's also important in nutrient uptake. We talked about soils and soil fertility a couple of weeks ago, but without water to move those nutrients in the soil, the plant's not going to benefit from the nutrients. And water can also be very critical when the plant is trying to set fruit. Tomatoes is an excellent example. If you think about it, tomato is, well, we like them nice and juicy, and that's primarily water. So if there's not enough water, the plant's not going to develop properly and set fruit properly. There are a lot of factors that may influence exactly what water needs that you have in your garden. Every crop is going to be a little different in individual needs. Some may be able to stand a little drier soils or a little droughtier soils or a period of drought better than others. Okra might not bear like you would want if it missed a rain or an irrigation, but it'll probably survive. Tomatoes, they're going to need the water when it's important. The age of the plant may also influence the amount of water that it needs. Soil moisture conditions and the soil type can also influence the water needs of the plant. And weather conditions can also influence water needs. If we have a hot, sunny day and it's a little bit windy, plants are going to use the water and draw water out of the soil more readily than they might on a cooler, cloudier day. So there are factors that may influence the plant's needs throughout the growing period. When we talk about water, we're not talking about the top of the ground being wet. We're talking about thoroughly wetting the soil. And if you are digging between the rows or maybe in the row between plants, go down 4-6 inches to really determine how wet the soil is. And sometimes in the summertime, the top of the soil, particularly if it's a clay soil, might dry out very quickly, and the subsoil still have some moisture left in it. So the depth of a shovel, just go down, see how damp or wet, moist the soil is, the depth that you can dig with a shovel. If it's new transplants or recently planted seed, maybe the first 3 inches may be all you need to check to begin with. But it's important to know not just how wet or dry the top of the soil is, but how deep it is within the root zone of the plant. And this chart gives you a good idea of when plants need water, some critical periods during their life that water is important. Broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and so on, lettuce, when they're developing that head, they need water. Carrots and the root crops, of course, when they're developing those roots that we plan to eat. Corn, during the silking and tasseling period, and when the ears start developing. That's a key period of time. Now the thing is, if it rains sometimes right after silking and tasseling, it may knock all your pollen off and you not pollinate. So water and timing there is important. Tomatoes and melons, cucumbers, eggplants, that fruit set from flowering through the development of the fruit is very key. And you can read the rest of those, but the part of the plant that we want to eat, when it is developing in the plant's going to need water. And it's going to need 1 to 1.5 inches of water each week. So, how are we going to provide the water? Well, one way, simply drag the hose out and water each plant. That could be a little time consuming. Carrying a 5-gallon bucket out to the garden can be a little time consuming and a little hard on the back. So you might want to think about some type of watering or irrigation system. And there's 3 main ways in which we apply water through irrigation: overhead, in furrow, and trickle or drip tape. We're going to talk about each of those in more detail. The overhead is the simplest. It may simply be a garden hose that you hold over the plant, or it may be a hose connected to a sprinkling system. They're very cost efficient. They're very easy to use and set up. It says portable. I've drug a few of these around that's what we used in the garden when I was a kid. Yes, they're fairly easy to move around, but you do have to move them periodically. Part of the problem can be uneven watering. You are wetting the plant when you use an overhead irrigation system. And wet plants is often a step in causing diseases. The plant, if it does not dry off during the course of the day, several diseases can be a problem. Also, these being overhead, you're spraying water. A lot of times soil gets splashed up on the plants using this method. And there are, particularly in tomatoes, the blights are soil-borne diseases. So they overwinter and stay in the soil until they find a plant that they can affect. So if you splash the water and soil up on the leaves and stems of the plant, you're bringing the disease closer in contact with the plant. Another problem with these systems is they often use more water than is absolutely necessary. So you may want to put the rain gauge up under the irrigation system and run it till you get the inch of rain or inch of water that you need, and not use more than absolutely necessary. Sometimes timing them doesn't always work that well. Leaf moisture, or water staying on the leaf, is absolutely required for many foliar diseases such as early blight, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. So if you do use overhead watering, do so late in the day, early evening, so that the plants will be wet overnight, and then during the day can dry out and the leaves not stay wet. You could also do it very early in the morning if you wanted to get up early enough, run it around daylight, first hour or so, where there's still dew on the ground. Then let the plants dry out. And this is really no different than actually rain coming down from overhead. So no, this is very much like rain. The problem is rain can also splash the soil on the sides of the plant and cause the same problem that we talked about with diseases as well. But this is a cheap, inexpensive, and fairly simple setup for irrigation. There is the furrow method. Now this is where you set rows and then have a deep furrow between rows, maybe between every other row. And you simply flood the furrow between the rows. This works really well in evenly spaced rows, level ground. A garden hose could be all you would need to provide the water to flood that channel. And you don't need a lot of pressure to use this. So if you collect rain in a rain barrel, then you may be able just to, that rain barrel's a little higher than the furrows or the row that you're flooding. Just open up the rain barrel and let it flow. Depending on the soil type, it can be a challenge. Your coarse or sandy soils may soak up or the water drain through before it even reaches the end of the row. If you have long rows or long areas, this may not work very well. It works really well in short rows. And of course, slopes can be a bit of a challenge. So nice level areas work best with the furrow method. Most gardeners around here may use the furrow for some of their gardens. Most would use the overhead, or if they want to invest in a system, you can look at drip irrigation. So, drip irrigation. It uses water economically. It doesn't wet the leaf surface as much, if at all, depending on how it's placed. A good system will provide a uniform supply of water to each plant. And if you have a water-soluble fertilizer, you can easily add it to this system, and it delivers it right at the plant itself. There are several common methods for this. Drip tape. Drip tape is a flat plastic tubing. It looks flat. It has the channels of the tubes that you simply plug in an external emitter or a small line that you can run to your plant. It's very common in landscapes with shrubs. They also make these drip tapes that have the built-in or internal emitters that are set evenly spaced, already built in. And all you do is simply lay it down the row and place your plants at the distance of those emitters. Those work really well in vegetable gardens. In a drip tube, which is more like a pipe with a built-in internal emitters set at even distances, work very well on raised beds. So let's look at these a little more. Drip tape. You will need a supply line, something to get the water from the hydrant or its source to the tape itself. And there are a variety of different types of tape available and a variety of spacings that you can choose from. Depending on your source of water, you may need to filter the water, particularly if it has particulate. So if you're on a well, it sometimes has bits of sediment that comes in, or if you have a surface source that has sediment, these little fine particles can clog the emitters. So a filter might be necessary. Hang on. Okay, I'm going the right way. So your supply line will come into the tape. You may want to place a valve at that point so you can control the water that is going into your irrigation line. And then think about then laying the tape along the rows. And as you can see in the picture, it does look a little flat. It'll kind of puff up when there's water pressure applied. These can be fairly inexpensive considering the amount of water. So you may spend a little more for the equipment and the supplies for this type of irrigation system, but you'll save on the water. Whereas in the overhead, you may spend a lot less on the equipment and the supplies you need, but you're going to be using a lot more water. The drip tapes can also give you a range of delivery rates, depending on the spacing and how much water is coming into the tape. So you can, with a valve at the connection from your supply line to the tape itself, you can control the amount of water that's flowing through. And this operates at fairly low pressures. It can work as low as 5 psi. And it can work as high as 20 psi. So you don't need a lot of water pressure to push the water through these drip tapes. And overhead, you're going to need enough pressure to get the water up high enough to get it out the distance that you want. So it's going to take a little more water pressure on a overhead irrigation system. And again, these are very efficient use of water. You're putting water where you want the water to be applied and not over the entire garden. And these come in kits. And these kits come with all the supplies that you need, all the bits and pieces. You got your drip tape, you've got your couplings to add your supply line. The little yellow thing is, this is where you can add your own emitter. So it's a little punch, and these little valves then stick into the tape right where you want it. Then you can, from there, that can be an emitter itself, or you can add a little length of tubing to go right to the plant. If you notice, they've laid it right along the row, and at each plant, they would be an emitter. Then, of course, you've got the little metal hoops that will allow you to anchor this to the ground. So these kits can be bought in most garden supply centers. They are pretty straightforward with their explanations and very easy to do. There's 200 feet of drip tape in this. This is actually also a filter built into this coupling. So you filters built into the system. There's a pressure regulator so that what's going into the drip tape is consistent, and you can get consistent then water application throughout the garden. There's mainline tubing, all the components. And off the top of my head, before you ask, I don't know exactly how much these cost. But I think a quick Google search or a quick search on some online supply places would give you a good idea how much. You'll probably find that they're not that expensive. And if you take care of these, they will last more than one season. So these drip irrigation systems, when they're installed, they have a delivery line. This is the delivery line. And then each line irrigating plants is connected. And each row has a little shutoff valve, so you don't have to irrigate every row every time. So if you have something different in each row, then you can time the application or the amount of water you need for each individual row. These also work very well under plastic mulches. So if you happen to use mulches or plastic mulch, then they work very well under plastic mulch. If they have internal emitters, as I said, these are already built-in emitters. They range from 6 to 12 inches in spacing. They are elbows and T's so that you can make all your connections in shape that you need. So this is laid off in a square for a raised bed. And it just simply waters at those spaces. Plants don't necessarily have to be in those spaces because you'll be watering eventually the entire bed if it's a raised bed with this system. But there is no wasted water in these systems. And then a drip tube is a very similar system. The tank is, as I said, looks very flat. You notice in the picture that it is flat when it's not inflated with water. Well, the drip tubes are basically little small diameter piping, and they vary in size from your supply lines or your main lines to small, about the size, the hole that the water moves through is about the size of a pencil lead in the standard number 2 pencil. And those little lines can then run to an emitter, which will add water right at the plant itself. Along those same lines is a soaker hose. These can be easily found in garden centers and supply places. They can be a bit of an expense because you're going to need a number of hoses to cover a large garden. Part of the problem is they do not apply water evenly. They are simply a porous tube that the water seeps out of. In some places it may seep quite a bit, and then, you know, a few inches or a foot or so away, a little bit of a trickle. So it doesn't evenly water the area. A good soaker hose might work in a container or something small, but if you're looking at several raised beds or a large garden area, this may not be the most efficient way to supply water. Going through the irrigation, just to give you some examples of the types of irrigation that are available. And the drip tapes, if you are willing to take a little time on the front end, a little expense on the front end, can be very, very effective and do a good job watering where you want the water to be. But they also do require a little care and a little maintenance. Actually, the overhead would as well, for that matter. It's just there are fewer moving components, or fewer components, so it's not as much to work with. So definitely need a means of applying water. And if you have a handful, you know, half a dozen or so raised beds, then maybe a garden hose and a would be enough to water those areas. But if you're a larger garden, I'm going to need some way of applying water. Mulches. And mulches is a good transition from the water requirements to our weed prevention, because mulches will help with both. Mulches is any material that will cover the surface of the soil, and it will help prevent weeds and retain soil moisture. It'll also help with soil temperatures. So it kind of moderates the temperature. There's not a fluctuation. In hot summers, mulch soils stay cooler. In the fall and winter, as we get into the late part of the season, soils that have been mulched will hold the heat and stay warmer as the air around them cools. And these mulches will also improve soil structure. You're adding the organic material on the top, and as it breaks down, it moves into the soil and adds to improve soil structure. It can reduce your cultivation labor. You're not going to have to work to get the weeds out. So there's no need to till for weed control. Or you will minimize your chemicals or other methods of weed control. By adding organic matter over time and improving soil structure, you're also going to help the soil absorb water better. It's going to reduce evaporation, so the soil does not lose its moisture as quickly from this evaporation. Crusting, which is a real problem if you have a clay soil. They get wet on the top, you get packed down with traffic, you walking on them, or fine textured after it's been tilled, they will harden and crust. So mulches will prevent that from happening. And it also reduces erosion. And as I said, moderates the temperature, helps with root growth and nutrient availability, and it reduces disease movement from soils to plant. What happens, and I might need to back up, I noticed the chat was talking about this. There are several diseases. Some of the more problematic diseases that we have in our gardens can live in the soil for a period of time. And as they stay in the soil, they're dormant. But if they get splashed up onto the plant during a hard rain or overhead irrigation, then the spores have been moved out of the soil up to the host plant that they need to go through the cycle of reproducing, and they can infect the plant. So rain splashing in your garden, while nice, good rain shower is exactly what we would prefer over having to irrigate, you can have some problems with erosion, crusting, and diseases that move from the soil up onto the plants from rain itself. So mulch will help with that as well. So what do we use as mulch? Well, there's several things that will work. Hay and straw, pine needles, bark, wood chips, leaves, newspaper, and cardboard. These are mulches meant for the top of the ground. So do not incorporate these into the soil, because a lot of these materials have not decomposed. And if you till them into the soil, they're going to start decomposing, and they need nitrogen to decompose. And the bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms that break down these organic materials would much prefer to have the nitrogen than your plant. It can be more aggressive at getting it. So they will tie up nitrogen very quickly in the process. So this is meant for the top of the ground. They will decompose as you go through the season, and you may have to add a little more, and that's fine. But as they naturally break down on the top of the ground, then earthworms And this the natural process of the soil, water moving through the soil will move those organic matter into the top layer of your soil, improving your soil. Now think about this, the hay and the straw, excellent, easy sources to find, probably very easy to find. Hay could have weeds. And you need to know the straw source, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Wood chips and bark, you may hear some folks talk about, be careful the type of wood you get. There's some publications out that says that black walnut could be a problem. Then there's publications out there that says maybe not as big a problem as we think. But know the source of your organic material. That's the key. Know what the components are and what these sources actually are. These organic mulches can also help reduce removal time at the end of the season. So when you're coming back and pulling out old plants, they're going to be much easier to pull out because the soil is going to be in better condition. Very effective in controlling annual weeds. We've mentioned organic matter being added to the soil. And the right kind of mulch can be porous and will allow water to move through the mulch and to the soil. And irrigation may not be required as much at all if it rains. But if you use plastic mulches, you're going to, of course, be blocking the water with plastic. So you're going to have to irrigate even with a good rain. We'll get to plastics in a minute. Here's some pros and cons for the different mulches. Straw, biodegradable, easily biodegrades, very easy to find, not that expensive, but you can have those weed seed. Hay and straw can actually keep the soil from warming very quickly in the spring of the year. So if you put straw down very early in the season, you're actually insulating and the soil doesn't warm. Sawdust and wood chips, again, can add organic matter over time. Again, can actually be very inexpensive, may actually be free. You can find the right sources. They tie up soil nitrogen if incorporated. So these can be great mulches, but they do not need to be added incorporated into the soil. Grass clippings can work. They can degrade very quickly. If you collect your own grass clippings, they're going to be free. Just make sure you've not treated your grass for weeds, because the very weeds you're trying to kill in your garden are the types of plants that you're trying to grow in your garden. Well, they're all broadleaves. So you're trying to control broadleaf weeds in your grass, and you're growing broadleaf plants in your garden. So whatever weeds you control, the method of control and herbicides in particular will kill the garden plants. Compost is very good, but you make sure it's properly composted and again, free from weeds and pathogens. If your compost pile does not heat up to over 170 degrees, which you think about is the temperature we cook meat to kill pathogens, and then the chances of there being weed seed or disease in your compost is pretty high. And that's really true if you keep adding plants or materials out of the garden itself. So just make sure if you're going to use compost that it has properly decomposed. So here's excellent example of straw and how it can be added to the rows. I want to back up just a minute. Newspaper and cardboard are listed, and they can make good mulches. Cardboard problem, there's two problems with cardboard. One, cardboard comes in many different types. They can be just plain cardboard. They can be some wax coated cardboards. If they're wax coated, they don't absorb water. Even a nice thick piece of cardboard is going to deter water from moving into the soil very quickly. In fact, the cardboard is going to become sopping wet before it even moves into the soil itself, which is also another problem because the cardboard becomes wet and usually stays wet. So cardboard, just sheets of cardboard might work in a walkway where you're not worried about that too much and want to keep the weeds at bay. If you're going to use cardboard as mulch, you might want to shred it and use the shredded pieces. It works very well shredded because then you've got bigger chunks and not a solid sheet. The water can move between the pieces of the cardboard to the soil, and air can move through and around the cardboard a lot easier. Newspaper, 1 or 2 sheets of newspaper and a little mulch on top can work very well as a mulching method. But again, a paper can be like cardboard. It can absorb a lot of water and hold water if you're not careful. So these two are at the bottom of the list, probably because they're not the best options. Hay, straw, and the others at the top work much, much better.
Sheldon, we have
Go ahead.
wondering if you mulch, do you till that in at the end of the season, or will it just break down over winter?
It will break down over the course of the season and over the winter. If you do till it in at the end of the season, then you're probably not going to want to plant a late fall crop in that area. It's going to need about 3 months or so to decompose before you can plant in again. But turning it in the late fall and not planting a fall crop into it would not be a problem. Just realize that you can't plant till spring. So, the mulches, the organic mulches have a lot of advantages, but we also have some inorganic mulches. And these are typically plastic mulches. Black plastic being the most common. They can warm the soil very quickly in the spring because you think about it, the black absorbs the heat. They do an excellent job at suppressing weeds, most weeds anyway. There'll be 1 or 2 that might make its way through. Clear plastic does not work as well because it may allow weed growth because the light can come through. Basically, clear plastic would create a greenhouse if you're not careful. There are many other colors that are available that are designed to reflect or transmit certain wavelengths, and you may see in gardening books and hear gardening gurus talk about the color of the mulch can help improve the fruiting of a plant. And research shows that might be the case. What's really most important for fruit development in any crop, whether it's grown on any organic mulches or with no mulch, is enough water and enough nutrients so that it can grow. But if you use plastic mulches, you will have to irrigate because most of these are not porous and will not allow the water in So you will need to water under the plastic mulches. So these black plastic mulches can be very cost effective, really helps retain soil moisture because the soil really can't escape. And it really retains the heat and keeps the soil warm. So it has some real benefits, but you must irrigate. Then what do you do at the end of the year with all that black plastic mulch? It's difficult to recycle it because it is covered in soil, in mud, in decayed plant material. And typically they're only good for one season. They make woven ground covers, which is basically woven plastic. These can be reused. They can be permeable to water and air, but they're rather expensive. And they really need to be taken up every winter. So at the end of the season, after you've grown your crop, these mulches will need to be removed. They make biodegradable plastic mulches, but you do not have to remove it at the end of the season. We don't know, it takes a while for them to break down, and sometimes a lot longer than you may want. So you're going to have bits of these biodegradable mulches still hanging out in your garden. They can be very expensive than the other two. So they're cost effective. It's not very cost effective for a small garden. So these plastic mulches, a single season. So there's a lot of benefits to mulches, but there are some drawbacks. Slugs and snails, they love damp, cool, shady areas. Exactly what you're creating when you add mulch. So keep an eye out for these two pests. The color of your mulches can affect the temperature. The lighter mulches can cool the soils in the spring or the fall because they reflect the light and don't absorb the light and the energy. They hold in soil moisture, but if we turn out to have a wet season from just a natural rainfall, then they could keep more moisture in than you would like. And this is definitely true. These three things are definitely true if you go with plastic mulches, because you are creating that perfect environment for slugs, and you're definitely stopping the evaporation process from happening when the soil is extremely wet. Landscape fabric is not really a great choice in this. A couple of things that could happen, even though they are somewhat permeable and they do allow water and air to move, they also do not keep the weeds down quite as well as the solid plastic mulches do. So they can be very thin material, so they can be very difficult to remove at the end of a season. So landscape fabrics are not necessarily the best choice for mulching. So let's talk about weed control practices.
Told me to shut up.
Before, got a question? One thing you can do if you have a small area for weed control is a process called solarization. Use a 1.5 to 4 mil thick plastic. You'll need 2 layers of clear plastic. During the summer, when that particular area is fallow, you can lay those 2 areas, those 2 sheets of plastic down and seal the edges. If you'll notice in the picture, let's see if I can. They've taken block, a couple of bricks, looks like, and use that to hold one layer of plastic above the other. One's laying flat on the ground, the other one's held up, You look around the edges, they've put soil over the edges to seal those edges so that you're creating a little mini greenhouse. So the soil has to be bare, it needs to be moist, so you might want to irrigate or moisten it just before. And the sun will naturally warm that area, and you're trapping the heat with that insulated layer because the air between those two layers of plastic is insulating. Temperatures then will rise, and you need to reach 120 degrees up to 130 degrees to kill weed seed. And if this is done properly, it can work. But it needs to be in place 4 to 6 weeks for it to really work. So, we're talking about doing it in the fallow at a fallow time in the summer. And most of us may not have a fallow time in the summer. But if you have a really problematic area, this may be a way to do it. It's only effective 1 to 2 inches or 2 to 3 inches into the soil. So it's only going to heat the top 3 inches of soil. So if you come in and till that area after you have solarized it, you may be turning up weed seed that has been buried. And a lot of the weeds that we have, the seed can last years in the soil. So it's a great way to get rid of weeds, and it works very, very well. This is probably my #1 recommendation for getting rid of weeds in a garden. It's not always the answer people want, but it is the surest way of weed removal. That's simply pulling the weeds or doing a little hoeing. And hoeing the top or tilling the first couple of inches of the soil periodically will keep the young weed seeds that have sprouted from growing and developing. If you do it in the first inch or two, you're not going to damage the root system of the plants. But if you get deeper than that, then you're going to expose more soil to sunlight, bringing up seed that will germinate and may actually damage the root system of the plants that you want to grow. This technique called the stale seed bed works really well. Prepare your seed bed about 2 weeks before planting. So by preparing this, we mean till it, work it, do what you need to do to have that seed bed ready to go. And then allow the weeds to germinate. And just before you plant, you can treat those weeds with a method called burn down. You could actually use a herbicide, or you can actually take a flamethrower. They make flamethrowers that are for garden weeding, and you can actually literally burn the weeds that have germinated. Once you've done that, you do not need to disturb the soil surface again by tillage. Only the row that you are planting in needs to be where you disturb the area. This can work very well as a method of controlling weeds. Just give the weeds time to germinate and then kill those weeds. It's going to be a problem. Most of your annual weeds are going to germinate very, very quickly, and most of them that are exposed to sunlight and water will germinate. So you can control a lot of weeds this way. There are chemical methods for weed control. It is probably the least used method in home gardens, probably because there's not many options. It's also the most expensive option in many cases. Herbicides come in several different forms, but there are two terms that you need to be aware of. There is pre-emergent herbicide, those that can be applied before you plant. Many of these pre-emergent herbicides do not have any long-lasting residual effect in the soil. So after a certain period of time, and the label will tell you exactly how long that will be, you can come back and plant most of your crops. In some cases, it can be as soon as the herbicide has had a chance to dry, so a couple of 3 days. In other cases, it may be 2-3 days to give it time to be effective with the on the weeds. Then we have post-emergent herbicides. These are herbicides that are labeled to use on certain crops after they have emerged. And the post-emergent are very limited in their options. As I said, most herbicides that we use in weed control will either kill or damage your crops. So you need to be careful, but there are options out there that can be used, particularly grass herbicides that can be used in your garden. Always read and follow the application label, the label for application. It is the instructions that you need to follow. And it will tell you exactly how much, when, and on what crops you can apply that herbicide. And we do have a publication that we have on weed control that I will send a link to for you to look at. Now, herbicides is something else you need to think about. The herbicides in the area can also be impacting. So if you're next to pasture fields or row crops, then the herbicides they use could be a problem. And you just need to be aware of that. And let your neighbor know who owns the field that you have a garden in that area, so that they can be aware of what's going on.
And roadsides.
Roadsides can also be a problem. They spray right-of-ways for roadsides and power lines in telephone lines. The chemicals you use in your lawn can also be a problem. So keep those away from your garden and do not move grass clippings from your lawn to your garden if you're controlling weeds in a lawn. If you are using herbicides, if you're using insecticides, so if you're using any pesticide, you need a sprayer for the different materials that you're using. So you'll need one for your insect control. You're going to need one for your broad spectrum weed control, that which kills every plant that it's sprayed on, such as Roundup. And you may also need one for your grass control or your broadleaf control, one for your yard chemicals. So different materials that you're spraying will need a different sprayer, because if you mix those up, you can have a real problem. This is an interesting picture. The area here where there's no plants growing was where they fed livestock this year before. And you can see the circle where the hay ring set. And what has happened is that the hay that was being fed had been sprayed for weeds, and it had residuals in the hay that kept the crops from growing. So they just took an old barn lot next to the barn and decided to put a garden there. Probably an excellent location. They'd fed, and there was herbicide residue from their pasture fields. So if you do use herbicides, they can move. So if you're spraying your yard for weeds, it can drift over into your garden. I guess I won't call any names, but I had a fella a couple of years ago he always grew some really great tomatoes. He carried the tomato into me one day and said, "What's wrong with my tomato?" It looks to me like herbicide drift. He stood there in a minute and looked at me. He said, "Well, it might be." I said, "Wait a minute. Didn't I tell you what to spray on your hay field across the road?" He said, "Yes, and I did the other day." So well, you also killed your wife's tomatoes. Or tried to kill his wife's tomato. I think they actually pulled out. But it will drift from your yard to your garden. So you need to be very careful when and how you use herbicides. So plants need water, and it can be very, very important that you supply the water they need when they need it. A lot of different ways that you can do this. Mulches can also be important in keeping soil moisture and temperature in a range that you want. They also control weeds. We have a lot of weed control methods in the garden, but the best is often those cultural practices, starting with a clean area, mulching, and mechanically removing the weeds that you have. And there are herbicide options, but that would be a last option that you would have, and they can be limited in your garden. So we'll stop the share and we'll look at questions. Questions?
I have one.
Okay.
So you showed that garden area that they had fed animals, that the hay had been treated for weed control,
Right.
and the residual was enough. How long do you have to wait for that residual to go away?
For that particular herbicide, 18 months.
Thank you.
So that particular one is only labeled for pasture. And that's when I said hay is a great mulch, then that's why you need to know the source of your hay. That particular chemical is used. It's not the most common weed control in pasture fields, but one spraying is all it will take. So do need to be careful. Some of those are also labeled for wheat. So that's another reason to know the source of your straw.
Sheldon, how do you tell how much water in inches you put down with like a drip tape?
That's a good question. One of the things you could probably easily do is to just measure how much water comes out of that drip tape. And most of those kits will give you some idea as to flow rate. So you're really not necessarily basing it on an inch range. You're actually looking at volume in a gallon or pint or whatever amount you want. So if you are applying the irrigation to a plant that's taking up a square foot, you want to apply an inch of depth of water, then you can be 12 square inches of water. And I haven't done the math, but I think you could Google that and find out how many gallons of water that would be. There's like 7.5 gallons per cubic foot of volume.
My wife's a math teacher, so she'll help me with that.
Yeah, there's a little math. It's interesting. Story problems were the absolutely one thing I did not like in high school math. That's all I deal with. They're story problems. Because you're converting you know, the gallons in this case to cubic feet or cubic inches of water. You know, we talked about fertilizers a couple of weeks ago. That's, you know, you're using percentages and fractions and yeah,
Sheldon,
yes.
if you put maybe like a baking pan underneath part of the drip tape and then
Yes.
catch
You
the
can
water.
catch it. You can catch it. Yes,
Catch one and see what's.
that will work. Just put something under there and catch
going on.
and see. And when you get an inch in the bottom of that pan, then however the area that pan covered, that'd be, you know, an inch for that area.
Right.
Man,
It's, yeah, I'm still got to do a little math. But it would not be that hard to calibrate the overhead because all you do is stick the rain gauge out there and it works. So if you're using a drip tape or even your garden hose, you just want to have to figure out your flow rates and base it on number of gallons you're applying. You know, when it comes to using just a good water hose, I noticed in the chat somebody said what would be a good way with a garden hose.
low flow.
Low flow and at the base of the plant. So you, instead of spraying the whole plant, if you can hold down next to the ground, it works really well. So you want to, they ask, mimic a soft rain shower, and that's a good idea as well. Using mulches will also work and help reduce the splashing. And again, the time of day, if you're going to do an overhead watering, even with a garden hose, early morning or late in the evening, when the plants have some time to dry out before the heat of the day.
Is it okay to use a combination of a couple of mulches? Say put grass clippings down and then put wood chips on top of it or vice versa, something like that?
That would work. That would work. Having a variety of different mulch types throughout your garden, or if you put down one type and then don't have it for the second round that you need additional mulches, that would work as well. But mixing them would not be a problem.
Straight paper.
Am I allowed to ask a non-watering question, but still garden?
Sure.
I'm harvesting my carrots and I found that some of them had been eaten from the bottom. So I'm assuming mold or void
Bowls.
Molds.
molds. So how do I get rid of those?
Quit feeding them.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, honey.
I will, I'll send you our recommendations on that. Voles tunnel, just like moles do, except they don't typically have the mounds that show up. They run a little deeper in the ground.
Okay.
So they do not like bare ground. So around, if you, in the orchards, if you notice, the strip where the trees is often void of vegetation. It's very clean. And that's because they like a little vegetative cover over them. There are some things you could use since they are plant-eating mammals. There are baits. The bowl baits, you know, they label have the peanuts or whatever that you can put out for moles. Don't work for moles at all, but they will with voles. So you can find their tunnels, you can bait the tunnels. Trapping them like you would moles would also work if you can find the tunnels.
Find your cat.
Cats and dogs,
Cat up.
they'll dig them out.
We've
They
got
also
the,
dig your carrots up. That's the other problem.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah.
thank you.
You
Hey
know,
Sheldon, I've got a question. I'm putting in a slaughterhouse right now, and I'm planning on using my wash water as irrigation. So it's going to have like a lot of blood and that kind of thing in it. Do you have any concerns about? I mean, obviously, blood's really high in nitrogen, but do you have any concerns about using using blood water, I guess, for irrigating field corn and that sort of thing?
Well, one or two could come to mind. The blood will attract a lot of animals. And the last time I talked to somebody who used actually dried blood meal as a fertilizer source, the coyotes and the neighbors' dogs dug it up.
Gotcha.
They went after, they dug the yard up trying to find the source of that blood because they could smell it. And he said it was the neighbors' dogs, the coyotes, something else. He said there was 2 or 3 things that came in after he put the blood meal down because they could smell it.
Gotcha.
So it attracted a lot of things. They could be some other considerations that I hadn't thought of by applying that, particularly overhead to the plants. So you'd have to put it down on the ground. It may be something that you could use. I'll have to think about that one.
Okay.
Let me,
Yeah, no worries.
yeah, let me
Yeah.
study on that one a little more. But attracting every dog in the community and every coyote in the country would be the first problem that I can foresee.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions on this? The second part of this evening was training and pruning. And this is some things to think about to help increase yield. We'll talk about the reasons why you may want to support or use support systems in your crops, the different ways that we can support the crops, and the materials you may need for trellising, staking, and so on, and some different support systems. The why is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of benefits to supporting your crops. You're going to decrease the disease pressure. You're going to get the crops up off the ground, particularly crops that vine or run and have, a large plant for just getting those plants up, letting the air move around. Fruit rot. Fruit that is in contact with the soil is more likely to have problems than one that does not come directly in contact with the soil. By getting the plants up, you're getting them into the light. Using these support systems can also save space. You're going to be able to move upward instead of outward with your plant. It's also very easy or easier to harvest some of these. If you cleaner fruit makes it easier to harvest. When it comes to picking beans, if you've got a row of beans, such as I turned my pen off, such as these here, for example, you got to bend over to pick them. Those it's going to be hanging from the poles. You may not have to bend over to pick, so it's just going to be easier harvesting. And these are down low, get splashed with soil and be a little muddier. These are up higher and cleaner. We talked about the soil-borne diseases already, and water splashing, carrying those diseases up onto the plant. By getting the plants up where air can move, the plants dry quicker, and you lessen the problems with diseases. We reduce the contact with the soil, reduce the moisture that's around the fruit itself, and then reduce the potential for fruit rot. Slugs and other pests also are minimized by raising the fruit up off the ground. And of course, if they're hanging from a trellis instead of laying on the ground under the leaves, then you've also improved air circulation around those plants. Lights can reach the plants and the leaves easier, better fruit set, more sugars because of the increased photosynthesis. So when you're trellising or when you're setting poles or laying out rows that are going to be supported, think about the direction that these runs, that the rows run. The north-south rows, comes up, sun in the east, it'll shine along the whole length of the row, sets in the west, reach the whole length of the row. So having the rows run north-south really could help increase the light. But when you increase the light that's going into or onto the plants, particularly with some fruit, you may increase the potential for sun scald, causing some fruit to split. So you could actually, some fruit might need a little more shading than they would have on a trellis. Tomatoes in particular, if it gets hot enough sunlight directly on them. Grapes in the fruit category can also be a problem with too much sun on the fruit itself. I mentioned space. You're going up instead of out. Cucumbers, beans, and tomatoes are 3 very commonly trellised or supported plants. Make sure when you are setting your trellises that you set a trellis in such a way that it's not going to be a problem with shading. But at the same time, you may use it to shade those crops that don't need a lot of sun. So by going vertical and going up with some plants, you're shading the plants on either side of it if you're not careful. These particular methods will make it easier to find the fruit and make it easier to harvest. As I already mentioned, you don't have to bend over, and it's much cleaner. Now this is a comparison of the different training systems. They looked for this is tomatoes. They on the ground in a cage, an old-fashioned tomato cage. Stake and weave method, which I'll mention in just a minute, in a trellis. Notice the trellis worked best for the fruit to mature quickly. It also had the largest fruit. It did not necessarily have the most marketable fruit. That came with the cage, which means that this fruit was the cleanest, less damaged. This trellising system, it becomes more exposed to everything out there, the rain, the insects, and so on. It had the worst case in fruit cracking, which is really a result of sun and light. It wasn't necessarily the, in comparison with the others, with fruit rotting, because these 3 methods had the fruit up high enough that it wasn't coming in contact with the soil. Fruit was also supported in a system where air circulated. Sunburn, it wasn't necessarily the worst. That was on the ground. One of the most expensive, the stake and weave turned out to be the most expensive. And it was the best for overall pest control because you could see any potential problems with a trellising system before it became a problem. Several different ways that you can trellis. They can be very practical. You can various heights, and Can be ornamental, they can be very ornate, or they can be very functional. They're a good way to maximize the space and use the space in a very efficient way. It is said that shading can be an asset if you plan your garden correctly. This is the Three Sisters. It's companion planting with a support system. You've got corn, pole beans, and squash all planted together. The corn grows up straight and tall. The beans then use the corn as the pole and grow up, and the squash then is along the ground. So this supporting system has been used for quite some time in various ways. If you think about trellising system, think about the materials you're going to need to support the crop. How much weight is there going to be that needs to be supported from the plant itself and the fruit that is produced? Maybe something like cattle panels, which is a wire frame fencing, or it could be something as lightweight as plastic netting. What kind of post are you going to use? You're going to be something permanent, set periodically through the garden so that it can hold, or is it going to be posts you can pull? The types of twine or string that you may use. How long is it going to take you to set this up and clean up in the fall? So there's several things to think about. When it comes to the support system that you use, the size and diameter of the poles that you're going to support. If you're using pole beans, how big around does the pole need to be for the beans to climb? I've already mentioned, is this going to be a permanently set support system, or is it going to be something temporary? Because if you rotate crops, then it may need to be temporary. How are you going to get the post into the ground? I'll show you a twine box and PVC box in just a minute. You have a means of pulling the post. A hand tool or a tractor. You know, the farm supply store sells what they call metal T-posts. It's just a straight T-bar with a little flat panel on the bottom to hold it in the ground. If the ground's soft, it can actually be pushed in the ground very easily. If the ground's very hard, it won't come out without some help. And you might need to think about where you're going to purchase your materials. Garden centers may not necessarily carry all the materials you're thinking about or might want to use as a support system. As you're looking at this, think about cost. You know, wood posts is pretty expensive right now. How long will it last? Metal post. Will you use wire or tine? You know, tine may not last more than a season. Wire you might be able to use over and over. Talked about panels, which can be reused. Now, biodegradable twine can cause issues by breaking down too quickly. Twine can also be a problem because it stretches and sags. Nylon will work really well and hold up really well, but you're going to have to take it all up at the end of the season. The nylon can also be a problem because it can pull on the stems and can cut into the stems. So it can be damaging to your plants. So here in this picture, when you think about the type of support system that you need to decide on the crop, think about how it's going to grow, and you need to consider how much space you have to actually support your crop. So there's several things to think about before you really decide on the best support method that you need for your crop. Depending on what you're growing, you know, let's take tomatoes as an example. Determinate versus indeterminate. Dr. Baumgartner talked about this last week, and we'll go through it real quick. But determinate grow and set fruit at a certain height. It's one and done. Staking and caging are not usually necessary, can be helpful, but you could possibly get by without a lot of support system on a determinate tomato. Indeterminate keep growing and producing fruit throughout the entire season. Usually frost or temperature in the fall of the year is what stops them from growing. The flowers are not necessarily at the terminal end of the plant. These can grow and grow. So staking and caging will absolutely be necessary just to keep them contained and manageable. Determinants also have a single stem. You know, they can be staked or simply caged. As long as you don't damage that growing point at the top of the plant, then need to protect it so you can then harvest your tomato. I'm sorry, this is indeterminate. Harvest your tomatoes throughout the season. So with the indeterminate, which keep growing all year, if you protect the growing parts of the plant, you'll have a plant that will last all season. And staking and caging will help with that. Your indeterminate tomatoes often have a little sucker that comes between the branch and the main stem. It's a little leaf. So you might need to prune a few of those suckers out. Not all of them, but a few of them, every other one, just so that you don't have a lot of bushy growth on the plant. This can be done by simply snipping or pinching that sucker. With your determinants, again, your stake height can be important. Pruning might be something you can do to help contain. But you need to watch that first flower is, because that's where your tomatoes are going to be. So do not remove that cluster of flowers. So you can be ready to harvest a large amount of tomatoes at one time. Pole beans, something you can be staked. You can be rather creative in how you want to do this. The old-fashioned way was to have a little teepee with 3 or 4 plants growing up those stakes. I've seen cattle panels used both in tomatoes and beans as well. There's typically 16 feet in length. They do make 8-foot length sections now. Put a nice solid post at the end of each of the 16 with a metal smaller pole in the middle to support. Let it run up the panel, and makes it very easy, and you're using the space upward. These pole beans are runners. If you're not supported, they're going to run along the ground. You know, still grow just as much, just will be all on the ground. Instead of taking a 6-inch row space, they're taking 6 feet or 12 feet. Bush beans might not need that much support, but depending on how tall they can get, you might want to have a bit of support for them. Certainly make it much easier if they're up a little to pick. These are known as bush type or bush beans, and the peas can also be in that category as well. By the way, your pole beans are indeterminate. Your bush beans are determinate. When it comes to your cucurbits, your squash, your watermelons, cucumbers, trellises work really well for those. They need to be a very strong support system. Watermelons pumpkins probably won't work very well on a support system if you're going large watermelons. I could just see a 50-pound watermelon hanging on this trellis, and that being a real problem. But small squash, small pickling cucumbers, they will do well on a trellising system. This is a stake system for tomatoes. It's known as the Florida weave. Basically, you set a stake about every other tomato plant, between every other tomato plant. And throughout the season, you'll weave a new round of twine around the plant. If you notice, they've got a PVC pipe. The ball will be held here. Run it through the pipe, just make it easier to handle. You'll come, tie it off, wrap it around. It'll be on one side of the plant, then that string will move to the other side, and it weaves back and forth. Then you turn and come back on the side that you have not covered yet. You just simply weave it up throughout the season. It works really well. Grass twine is not that hard to find. It doesn't last throughout the season. So you may want to find something that works much better than grass twine, but it can be a very simple method of staking your tomatoes. This is what they use in commercial systems. There we go. You know, the determinant, you're going to need the 5-foot stakes, you know, so they don't need to be more than 5 foot high. Your indeterminate can get it 6 foot or taller, so they don't need to be tall enough that they can climb up the stakes or up your trellising system. And as the plant continues to grow up, even if you're using a system like we were talking about, the stake and weave, the Florida weave system, they can still get that height as well. So you think about it, if you're going to be adding a new string every so often, you get a plant that gets up to 6 foot tall, you're going to be working head high or higher, trying to add another layer of, or another round of twine to hold your tomato up. So a panel or something that's put up to start with may be much easier. They do make baler twine or tobacco twine work really well for your twine. Your tomato twine, what they use in commercial system. So this is a method that commercial operations use. It can be a little labor intensive because you have to add a line of twine every so often. Caging works really well with tomatoes and peppers. And there's several ways you can buy the preformed cages, kind of a V shape to get taller as they go up, and the tomato just fills the cage. Or you can make your own. These are simply page wire fencing that has been, there's a metal post somewhere holding it, and then they just wrapped the cage around the post or the plant and let the plant grow up into it. These squares, whatever you decide to use for your caging, if you take fencing, just make sure the holes in that fencing is large enough for you to reach through so you can harvest your tomatoes. And you can find, you know, different heights depending on the type of tomato that you are growing. There are a lot of creative ways that you can support your plants as well, particularly if you're using trellising system with some of the cucurbits. Some of these materials can be natural or synthetic. You know, the problem with a lot of this is light can break down the material. Synthetic can take more time to clean up and do not break down. So, you know, the size of your plants can determine the size of the material you want. When it comes to the end of the season cleanup, there is some things to think about. If you're using a trellising or any kind of support system, you're going to have to clean it up. You're going to have to dispose of any materials that you may use. If you use cattle panels, how do you get the vines off the panels? Pulling them off may be where. How do you clean up the Florida weave? Well, most of the time they go through and take a sharp knife beside the stake and just simply cut the lines and pull those out. So it's not that hard. You come back and pull the stakes. You know, the cattle panels, you know, you're going to have, if you got a really vegetative, a lot of vegetative growth, it may be very hard to pull them off of the, and out of the garden itself. Had a neighbor that used cattle panels to trellis his tomato zone, and you could get them over 4 or 5 foot high, 5, 6 foot in some cases. And these cattle panels set about a foot or so off the ground, and it was a 24-inch panel. And he had another layer of something up there to help support it as well. I asked him what he did at the end of the season. He said, I just come through and cut the strings that it's tied it, let it fall. You get my tractor and drag it out of the way. You hang it on the side of the barn and let the plant material dry. Then he said one warm winter day, I come out and pull all that off and get it cleaned off. So it took him about 3 steps, but it worked for him. It worked for him. He grew some really good tomatoes that way. It says, how can you say character building? Well, you know, it takes time and effort to do this. So some good old fashioned hard work. And when it comes to using trellises and support systems, you know, it makes fertilizing and managing your plants. So we'll take just a few minutes to talk about in-season side dressing. Of course, you need a soil test to know how much you need to add. You're going to scatter the fertilizer in about a 4-inch band out from the plant, about 4 inches, to keep it from burning. Needs to be watered in. So right before you irrigate or before a good rain. And it's just simply going down the row and adding a little fertilizer to the row. But particularly nitrogen is side dressed. So, any questions on support systems?
I had a question, Sheldon. You said that some of these, it's best to grow them on a north-south row.
Yeah, have your row running, you know, running north-south so that when the sun comes up, it covers the whole row. If you think about a row that's running east-west, it's going to come up, it's going to hit the east side, go across the top of the row, and then set on the west side. So it doesn't get to the sides of the row. So if your row's running north-south, the sunlight hits the all sides of the row.
Does, if you're going to use some of the trellising plants as shading plants for, say, like you have lettuce growing next to it or something, do you then want to put that on the west side so that it shields it in the afternoon? Is that the best plan then?
You would put it east side, more than likely, to shade it from the, you put it on this where it would be shaded from the afternoon sun. So you think through that for a second, to make it on the west side of the plants, shaded from the hot afternoon sun. Put it on the west side so that it's shaded from the heat of the sun.
Sheldon, what do you think about mushroom compost used in the garden? Is it a good fertilizer, or, you know, at the beginning of the season, or not?
It is a good source of material. uh, there can be some salts that come from mushroom compost. So you probably don't want to use it every season or use it, if you buy some every year, use it, different places throughout. I will say this when it comes to adding compost. Compost may not have a lot of nutrients percentage-wise compared to synthetic fertilizers, but they are a fertilizing material. And over time, you can actually build the soil nutrient levels in the soil to the point that you can cause problems. I actually looked at a soil test where that's basically what he'd been doing for about 5 years. He's adding compost to his raised beds. And he had very high levels of phosphorus and potassium and one of the other micronutrients. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. And his pH was also starting to creep up to a little over 7. So he's getting to this point where instead of the nutrients are going to be readily available to the plants to the point of being toxic. So even using compost, you can over fertilize or add too much nutrients. So having a good soil test, having a good idea of what the nutrient content is of this compost that you're applying in, that could be a general, rate that you might find, maybe not specifically for that material, and just use that as a guide to determine how much you need to apply and when.
Sheldon,
Yes, sir.
Sheldon,
Yes.
Norton's now has worm castings. It's $100 cubic or cubic yard. Yeah,
Cubic yard. Okay.
they do have it now, and they have quite a bit of it.
And worm castings are a good compost material. They work really well as an organic material. Again, it does have some nutrients, and if you keep adding lots of organic matter, you can actually increase the levels of phosphorus and potassium in the soil. The other problem that sometimes occurs with organic matter is we can get the phosphorus and potassium out of balance. One's really high and one's really low. And that can cause problems as well. So a good soil test, realize that the composting can be a fertilizing material, and being careful how much you apply. I got another story when it comes to fertilizing and recommendation. It happens to be the same one who sprayed his wife's tomato with his pasture spray. He just always did what Daddy did, which was a little fertilizer at the start of every season, plant his garden and move on. So last year he didn't get much of a garden. And when we really got to looking carefully, the soil nutrient levels were so high that the chemistry that takes place there is just really messed up the plants that we're trying to grow. So you can actually have too much nutrients. You can still grow a few things and do well. Corn would grow okay or grow well in that area, but his turnips, his okra, some of the beans just didn't produce like he thought they ought to. It also happens with adding organic materials. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I have a question. We've got some broccoli ready to harvest, and it grew through the winter, and it's kind of purplish in color, the heads, the florets. And I'm just wondering, is that going to affect the flavor? Or do you know Is that just because there's not much sun right now?
So I put it out too late last fall. And then it survived the winter and now it's heading and looking, but it's a pretty purple instead of a green.
Maybe a rat.
Well, it might be variety, but I'm thinking it's probably light, lack of light, not enough sunlight to photosynthesize. Because photosynthesis is chlorophyll, which is the green color, but there's a lot of other chemicals that are in those plants. And you think about it, when trees, in particular in the fall of the year, stop photosynthesizing, purples and reds start showing up. And that's simply because those chemicals colors are starting to show through because there's no more photosynthesis. So
I guess as soon as we harvest it, we'll know whether it tastes good
it
or not.
will, I'd say there would be some flavor difference just because it's not photosynthesized as much as it normally would. Any other questions? Did you have, on the broccoli, did you have anything protecting or just this didn't get cold enough this winter?
I really didn't have anything protecting. I didn't cover it with any plastic or anything. But it's in the middle of our field, so it got whatever sun was out there, it got. But
Okay, when did you first notice the purple color?
as it's heading, it grew about 24 to 30 inches tall, and now that it's warming up, it's heading and the heads are a greenish.
Not quite that tall. but,
Purple.
yeah,
Okay.
it's-
What I was thinking was 2 weeks ago, it got really, really cold,
So it might have been a little frostbite.
maybe frostbite. So I don't know what that would do at all to the flavor or to the quality of the fruit. It could be frost or cold damage. It survived that long, and then I mean, that would have been really hard on it.
Yeah. Well, after 35 years of marriage, I didn't know that he didn't care for broccoli. So I brought home 48 plants of broccoli last fall, planted them, and then he went, I don't really like broccoli. And I'm like, I've got 48 plants out there. So he's going to learn to like purple broccoli before it's all over with, I have a feeling. So
Or not 36 years of marriage.
Cook it with lots of cheese.
cheese. Okay. Thank you, Brian. Cheese it is.
I guess I'm telling all the stories on the neighbors. She thought she had broccoli. I don't know, this has been 40 years ago.
No, she had cabbage.
Cabbage, she wanted cabbage. It turned out it wasn't growing right. It's getting too tall and wasn't getting big enough. It turned out to be Brussels sprouts.
Brussels sprouts.
Turns out the family liked Brussels sprouts. So she grew Brussels sprouts from then on.
She raised 13
The
kids.
broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, there's 4 or 5 others. They're all the same plant. They're just different varieties of the plant. So for head cabbage, you're eating the leaves. For broccoli and cauliflower, you're actually eating the flowers. Brussels sprouts, you're eating the bud before it flowers. Kale is also one of those, is also a cabbage.
He might like the broccoli tempura style. Everything fried is good. Tastes good. Yeah, she laughed.
Okay, any other questions? No? All right, next week is the 16th of March, and Mr. Tom Stebbins, he's the extension agent in Hamilton County, is scheduled to join us to talk about pests in the garden. And those of you who have may have heard Tom speak in person, this is his area of expertise, and he is really good at talking about pest and pest management, and particularly how to identify pests. So I'll just go ahead and give you, I guess, the main point that he's going to make. First thing to do in solving a pest problem is to properly identify the pest. And he's going to talk about how to do that next week. So last call for questions.